Greetings, and welcome to this edition of Peter's Field Hospital, the official podcast for the website Where Peter Is. I'm Mike Lewis, and today David Lafferty and I are joined by a very special guest, Austen Ivereigh. Austen is a writer, journalist, and commentator on religious and political affairs. He is the author of the 2014 biography of Pope Francis, The Great Reformer, Francis and the Making of a Radical Pope. He is also the author of last year's Wounded Shepherd, Pope Francis's Struggle to Convert the Catholic Church. His latest project, a book called Let Us Dream, The Path to a Better Future, will be released on December 1st of this year. Let Us Dream is the result of exchanges between Austen and Pope Francis during the coronavirus lockdown. But before we talk to Austen, here's an important message. Before we begin this episode of Peter's Field Hospital, I would like to make a special request. If you appreciate our work at Where Peter Is, and you've gotten something out of our articles and podcasts, please consider becoming a supporter on Patreon. Patreon is a crowdfunding platform that enables fans, or patrons, to make a monthly contribution to support content creators. Running Where Peter is not free. Our apostolate has grown to the point where I have begun to work on it full time. If we are going to succeed, we need your help. If you would like to support our work on Patreon, please click on one of the links to our Patreon page, or on the button on the right-hand column of wherepeteris.com. Thank you very much for your generosity. We can't do it without you. Austen, great to have you. How are you?
It's good to be back, Mike. I'm fine, thank you. How are you?
Very good. So it's been a big couple of weeks. So thank you for giving us some of your time when all of this transpired. The new encyclical, the statements made by the Pope about civil unions becoming a big news story, the new cardinals, your upcoming book. Honestly, we're very grateful that you're giving us this time, because I don't know if there's any guest we could have that could potentially shed as much light on Francis's thinking on these topics.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Mike. It's really, really good to be with you. And you're right, a lot's been happening. And as always with this Pope, things move fast. And but anyway, great to be with you and great to have the chance to reflect on some of these things. We've had the encyclical Fratelli, Tutti, we've had the civil unions row, we've had a whole lot of new cardinals announced. Then, of course, we've got Francis and whether he should be wearing a mask or not. So anyway, you tell me what you want to dig into.
Why don't we start with Fratelli Tutti? Now, you had some of the inside track on this encyclical as it was being composed. You were hiding it from the world that you were conducting these interviews, these conversations with Pope Francis. So I'm sure you were at least somewhat in the know about this big project that he was working on, because I don't think it was announced until maybe 2 or 3 weeks before it was signed. Maybe you can shed some light on how this encyclical came about.
Yeah, no, that's right. I think it was actually a fairly well-guarded secret, certainly by Vatican standards. I think there's been talk for the last, I'd say 2 years, that something was coming. Nobody knew whether it was going to be on, the issue of war and peace, immigration. There were lots of topics that were floated. And I didn't know till I first saw it and heard about it, that it would be on fraternity and that it would be so closely linked to St. Francis of Assisi. But you're right, I did get a glimpse of it early on because, as you say, I've been working with Pope Francis over the summer on a book which is coming out on December the 1st, which I know we're going to discuss later. It's called Let Us Dream, The Path to a Better World. And it's the result of conversations with me and lots of exchanges that Francis and I had during lockdown, really over the summer. And so as part of that, he was keen that I should see the encyclical so that we could refer to it in the book. So I saw it in Spanish, and I think it was a late draft, let's call it. It wasn't the final version. So yeah, I had some glimpse of it.
When I had heard about the encyclical and I was trying to anticipate what would be covered in it, I was thinking that this idea of human fraternity would be focused on interreligious dialogue in particular, especially given the symbolism of St. Francis visiting the Sultan and that sort of thing. In the end, actual interreligious dialogue played less of a role than I thought it would. But at the same time, I'm wondering if you agree with this. There's a sort of shift in perspective where the way that we are supposed to relate to other people as Catholics in a radically pluralistic world, a radically divided world in many ways, should incorporate some of these principles of interreligious dialogue, in the sense that we need to establish connections at a sort of basic human level and establish mutual respect with people who think differently before we get into disagreements over particular values or ideology. Do you think there's anything to that, this idea that it seems like it's taking this concept of interreligious dialogue and making it more of a way that we approach dialogue with everyone, with not just people of other religions, but of people who think differently, of people of different cultures? Do you think there's any truth in that?
I do, David. I think that's spot on as ever. I think what's going on here under Francis, which you can see beginning really in many ways under Benedict, but Francis has really taken it on, is the idea that interreligious dialogue and also Christian unity dialogue is not about resolving theological differences. Primarily, it's about establishing bonds of trust and friendship and fraternity, we can now use that word, that allow you, as it were, to walk together, to witness together, to act together. And then in doing that, in forging those bonds, you create then space for the kind of understanding without which religions, cannot grow together. And I think the other dimension of Francis's interreligious dialogue is that it's about concrete acts of mercy together, witnessing to God's mercy through practical charitable action. And at another stage, even a third stage, to get moving on from that to forging alliances between religions, between churches, between, frankly, anybody of goodwill, to rebuild society from below. And I think this is a really big theme for Francis. So I think the fraternity document, even though you're absolutely right, isn't primarily concerned with interreligious dialogue, nonetheless takes forward the document on human fraternity that Francis signed in February last year in Abu Dhabi, which is why it's called the Abu Dhabi document, with the Grand Imam of the Al-Azhar Institute in Cairo. And that document ends with a series of pledges that Francis is making on behalf of the Christian world, together with the man who's, in many ways, symbolically anyway, has a leadership role in the Muslim world. So together, the two great monotheisms, but then implicitly also inviting all other religions to make the same pledge. So it's a series of commitments, and Fratelli Tutti ends with those same pledges, which, if you read them, is a kind of, what can you call it, a manifesto for interreligious cooperation, for the rebuilding of society from below, and rescuing politics from the fundamentalists and the secularists.
You mentioned politics, and Pope Francis here in the document Fratelli Tutti talks about a new politics, the need for a new politics, and he even uses the phrase, I believe, politics of love. It strikes me that he is very much affected, very concerned about the impact of polarization in our world. And it seems that you're in England, but I'm sure you're catching wind of what's going on in the United States in terms of polarization. You're either with us or you're against us, and there's no middle ground, or if you take the middle ground, you're going to be attacked by either side. And I get this sense of a growing contempt. Now, having watched this resistance to Pope Francis unfold, I've seen a lot of contempt directed at him as a pope. It's as if at a certain point, a critic of his makes a decision that he can do nothing right, that he's always awful, that Fratelli Tutti is filled with heresy and a rift in tradition and is the worst papal document that's ever been put out. But that's sort of a mini version of what's happening globally between people with different ideas. And in the political realm, I know that his ideas get attacked on a regular basis. I know that he proposes a path forward, and while he uses the word dream a lot and he uses the word hope a great deal, he's also a realist. This is a question I asked Steve Millies during our live event. What do you think Pope Francis sees as the practical, positive response to what he's advising?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I think chapter 6 of Fratelli Tutti, called Dialogue and Friendship in Society, will come to be seen in the future as perhaps the key chapter. I know there are other chapters which are extremely important, and obviously chapter 2 is the theological heart of the document. But just in terms of the way this document speaks to our current plight, I think I would hold up chapter 6, because he identifies and he names the very illness that afflicts not just America, but believe me, many societies, including my own, which is the paralysis of polarization, the growing tribalization of politics, the way that truth no longer matters. What matters is which side you're on and how loudly you can shout at the other. So rather than dialogue, which is about a humble together, searching for the truth together, you have a game of power. And he talks about it in the chapter. It's really a power play in which I struggle for the dominance of my narrative and I have to defeat you. Now, I think faced with this, look, an encyclical, a social encyclical, is about, first of all, naming giving a diagnosis of where we are socially, and then to sum up or to frame church teaching in response to that. So in a way, an encyclical by definition can never be really practical. I know in Laudato Si there was a final chapter giving a few suggestions, but mostly encyclicals aren't. The great thing about, if I can just plug for our book, for Let Us Dream, is that I actually get him to go into how he thinks we can build consensus and dialogue in context of polarization, and how it is specifically, I think he sees as a specifically Christian witness at this time, which involves sacrifice and to some extent martyrdom. It's a witness, right? In other words, we're not going to be appreciated for it, but how we can, without fueling polarization and without running from conflict either, how we could, as it were, get in there and become forces for reconciliation. And therefore, Let Us Dream in the second part of the book is really, I think you're going to absolutely love it, Mike, but I can't say more about that just yet because I'm not allowed to talk about the contents of it in detail. But I would say in chapter 6, there's a quote which I really want to share with you. It's from number 202. Well, so first of all, he's talked about in 201, it becomes easier to discredit and insult opponents from the outset than to open a respectful dialogue. So he talks about how we're all engaged in these parallel monologues, this aggression, and so on. But then in 202, he says, the heroes of the future will be those who can break with this unhealthy mindset and determine respectfully to promote truthfulness aside from personal interest. God willing, such heroes are quietly emerging even now in the midst of our society. So you see here, even though it's very dark and very polarized, he sees, here's the grace, the germ of the something new, the witness. So I think that's how Francis, sees it in a nutshell. And I think what he's giving us in Fratelli Tutti and giving us very practically in Let Us Dream is a kind of guidance for how we can do that. You're living through the US election. Here we've lived through Brexit. We all know what tribal, and we're witnessing it to a remarkable extent, as you said, in our church. And so this presses down on all of us. And in a way, the Christian of the future will be a depolarizer or will just be sucked up into the war.
I love that idea of the Christian of the future as a depolarizer. I think that's a really effective way of putting it. This is maybe a bit of a sort of challenge to Pope Francis, but some people read a document like Fratelli Tutti and they see it as, oh, it's stuff about dialogue and cooperation, and it all seems very wishy-washy, right, to them, or it kind of sounds like the kind of stuff you might hear from global organizations that are trying to encourage like development, like with the UN and that sort of thing, and they associate it with a kind of UN style of dialogue. How would you separate Pope Francis's approach to fostering dialogue and global cooperation from, say, the approach that we maybe would associate with organizations like the United Nations? Are they the same? Are they different? Is there any substance to that criticism that some people have said that Pope Francis it sounds like he's turning the church into an NGO. Is there any substance to that at all, do you think?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I think it was difficult for a lot of the media to get their teeth into this document because they assumed, as you said, that the Pope was telling us to be nice to each other, and that isn't news. And after all, aren't we all supposed to be nice to each other? In fact, when you pick up Fratelli Tutti, you discover it's a very radical document. It's a very offensive document. You see, depolarizing is not about not giving offense. Sometimes you've got to give offense. Sometimes you've got to name the truth. And in the document, he names all sorts of truths, which of course have made people very uncomfortable. But that's the prophetic dimension. And that's where he sees, and that's where I think the big difference between Francis's approach and almost anybody else is that he's always going to the spiritual roots. And by that, he's using his Jesuit great capacity for discernment to detect movements of the bad spirit, which are very often, of course, disguised as angels, because the devil only seduces nice people by pretending to be nice. We see this in our own church. It's those people who claim to be the really orthodox Catholics, the ones who claim that the church needs saving from itself. They're the ones, of course, who cause the real chaos and are the most aggressive and the most violent and most self-righteous, because they've assumed that mantle. But Francis, I think, in this document is always about naming that. And for example, the stuff on populism is really quite brilliant. He really nails what is populism. And he says it's using, in the name of the people, it's a means of gaining power. But actually, it's instrumentalizing the people and so on. So I suppose to brief answer to your question is, Francis isn't afraid to give offense and to name the bad spirit where he sees it, even if that's going to make some people very uncomfortable.
When we're speaking about making people uncomfortable, and this plays into what you're talking about with populism, riling up the people, and it's something that we have been trying to address since day one with Where Peter Is. It's basically how these opposition leaders, whatever you want to call them, these media figures, these rogue prelates, who they'll take something like Amoris Laetitia, which is a very long 8-chapter exhortation, or they take the document on human fraternity, and they pinpoint one sentence, one footnote, and they turn that into the entire narrative. And I guess the thing that I'm noticing within the church is that they've been very successful, at least in the US, of turning the focus into a one issue question and ignoring the forest for this one tree that they're convincing people isn't in continuity. I know a day or two after the encyclical came out, a fairly prominent Catholic journalist, rather than talking about the encyclical, celebrating the encyclical, was focused on the word inadmissible in the teaching on the death penalty. And once again, there are, I guess, 2 or 3, if not more, hot button quotes or sections in this encyclical. The teaching on the death penalty, obviously, this is, I guess, other than the CDF document, his largest and definitely his most formal or authoritative teaching on why the death penalty is inadmissible. Also, the fact that he keeps calling back to that Abu Dhabi document, even though he doesn't mention the plurality of religions question, that was the supposed heresy in that document, but that sort of got people's ire up, that I think he mentioned the imam 5 times in the document. Is he cognizant of the things that he says that will become media controversies? Does he have a good sense of that? And does he have ideas about how to address that? Or alternatively, is it really our responsibility as faithful Catholics who are in communion with the Pope to try to provide the clearer, truer, fuller picture of what he's saying?
Well, I mean, Mike, you do it so well, and David and all of you do it so well Where Peter Is. What you do is, as faithful Catholics, you say, what is the Pope trying to tell us here? And you compare it, with church documents and the gospel and the words of Jesus Christ, and you show that it's all part of the same thing, which of course you would expect, because the Pope is the successor of St. Peter, is anointed by the Holy Spirit. And that's what we believe as Catholics, that the Pope is really always evangelizing, whatever the status of what he says, whether it's an interview with a journalist or comments on a plane or an encyclical, he's always teaching, he's always evangelizing. And as I know him, that is who he is. And so he just he speaks the truth. Now, does he take into account every time he speaks about what headlines this is going to generate? No, I really don't think he does. And I think that part of the reason for that is that in a strange way, even though I think he's one of the great communicators of our age, in a strange way, what makes him such a great communicator is that he's actually not particularly strategic. He doesn't, in other words, think through every time he speaks, which constituency will this appeal to and how do I need to frame that? So that's really not how he thinks. And because that isn't, he will just speak. So to some extent, and I hope I don't sound, this doesn't come out wrongly, but to some extent he doesn't care. The truth is the truth. He's there to preach the gospel. He has that same parousia, that same apostolic courage that Jesus had, that the early apostles had. And ultimately, as I've often said in response to people who say, what do you say to all those people who are critical of Francis or angry at him? I say, well, this is not a popularity contest. He's not about being popular. And again, there's no surprise. Every pope has been ferociously attacked. One of the things that I think Francis does, and I think you've pointed this out, is that he does almost better than anybody else ever, is he exposes ideology in others. So in other words, in preaching the gospel so clearly as he does, he elicits from other people often expressions which then are very revealing of their, frankly, their ideology, which is dressed up as faith. And this is part of the role of a pope in a way. The pope has to be constantly challenging the church and exposing those things which are not of the gospel. And I think that's what we've seen to a remarkable degree in this pontificate.
I'm fascinated by the idea of the dream as a sort of genre of writing, which is, as far as I know, pretty unusual for church documents and that sort of thing. Do you think, what is the significance of this idea of the dream? Maybe the new book will speak to this a little bit. Why does Pope Francis choose to express himself that way and to invite us into dreaming with him? And is this connected in any way to his idea of discernment?
Yeah, the origin of the title of the book, Let Us Dream, it was originally Come, Let Us Dream. And the idea of that was Isaiah, is it 8 or 12? But come, let us talk this over. Yeah, this is God, of course, speaking to Israel. Come, your sins were scarlet, I shall make them white as snow. So, come, let us talk this over. Let's imagine this. Let's think this one through. And of course, in doing that, what we're doing is we're making space for another future, another world, another possibility. Because dreaming is all about allowing in possibilities which, if you like, by day get driven out or are excluded. Of course, and I will need to be speaking a lot more about this when the book comes out, precisely because of the title. But of course, he does use the dream language as well in Querida Amazonia, his post-synodal apostolic exhortation following the Amazonia Synod, which is constructed around his 4 dreams for the Amazonian region. And I used that in a retreat I gave here actually for the Jesuits. So you have your social dream, the cultural dream, the ecological dream, and the pastoral or ecclesial dream. And this is Francis really having listened in the Synod to an extraordinary number of people talk about things which on their heart. Then, as it were, takes a couple of months and responds with this imagining how things should be and how we can help to bring that about. And the reason for choosing that motif in our book is that, of course, the COVID crisis is a massive stoppage. It's a massive moment where our ideas have run out, our ideologies have failed, the economic model we were using, and so on. And politics fails, everything fails in a stoppage, and then gives you the chance to reimagine things, as of course we all have to some extent in our own lives during lockdown. So there's tremendous suffering in the COVID crisis, but there's also a tremendous opportunity and a grace if we're capable of receiving it. And that's really what the book, by the way, is about. It is about being able to understand, being able to look now in a way perhaps that we couldn't, see things that we couldn't, and then learn to distinguish where is God speaking to us, where is the bad spirit speaking to us, what brings us life, what takes away life, what's humanizing, what's dehumanizing. And having, as it were, the luxury of seeing these things much clearer, you're then able to choose in the right way and then to propose actions which flow from that. It's really the See Judge Act, made famous by Cardinal Cardijn, the Belgian cardinal, back in the 1920s. But the Latin American church has really taken this idea of See Judge Act, and Francis very much acts out of that. And so I proposed to him in the book that we use that three-part structure. So yeah, dreaming in a biblical way, which involves an element of warning, the dreams that Joseph has, that he must flee to Egypt. So there's an element of warning, and then there's also the dream which imagines new possibilities, which open up new horizons.
It's a funny coincidence that as you were talking about dreams, I wrote down a little note to myself and I wrote the word imagination. And then you said imagination about 2 seconds later. And this is something that actually has jumped out at me since early in this papacy. When he was elected Pope, I was just blown away by what he had to say. I was like, he's opening up my imagination, my Christian imagination. And then as the family synods approached, the very first family synod, for example, I noticed a lot of people, for example, criticizing Cardinal Casper's proposal and criticizing the idea that we were going to put these issues of accompaniment and reception of sacraments on the table. And to me, the thing that occurred to me was what Pope Francis was really asking for was, this is the gospel, this is doctrinal truth, this is what the church teaches, this is what the church has practiced. But let's imagine if there are different ways to practice this teaching that apply that are more relevant to today's world. Now, I think the church has really been thinking in this framework since the Second Vatican Council, if not earlier. But I think a lot of Catholics are still perhaps, and I grew up in the typical American conservative Catholic scene, basically saw Catholicism as this consistent, unchanging bulwark of truth from which it will, and truth was probably a lot broader than what the core essential truths of the gospel are. I can relate to that frustration that people feel, and I feel bad that they're caught in it because they're unable to distinguish between what we've always done and imagining what is possible without sacrificing that truth. And I see that very much in Pope Francis. He's willing to discuss. He doesn't get offended at ideas. Yeah, one of the funny things is Cardinal Casper's proposal was not accepted. It was not the outcome of Amoris Laetitia. He wanted something to take place in the public forum. He wanted a formal situation. And what Pope Francis prescribed was something much more private, much more case by case. Yet his critics seemed unable to distinguish the difference between those two proposals because they both deviated from what the church had practiced up until that point. And I wonder if you have given any thought to, other than Pope Francis and his successors continuing to repeat this point, but to instruct Catholics about using their imagination and being creative in their approach to faith that many don't seem to realize right now.
Because the great glory of this pontificate and the thing that disturbs people so much is really the same thing, which is that Francis treats us as adults who are invited into a mature relationship with God through Jesus Christ. And a mature relationship means one where we're praying, where we're open to the Holy Spirit, where we discern and we ask ourselves constantly, not simply, what does the church say about this? And as if that's enough and that's settled everything and we can then sit back and declare the rest of the world ignorant and guilty, but rather to ask, what does God want in this concrete situation, so that the church teaching doesn't become a refuge, an excuse not to engage with the world and to grapple with those difficult questions, but rather, like in Francis's case, the springboard from which we can then re-engage the world in a way that is open to new possibility, to new circumstances, and to what the Holy Spirit has to tell us in this time. And one of the great ironies, I think, is that those that accuse Francis of lack of fidelity tradition are themselves, I find, the least traditionalist people, at least traditional, I should say, people of all, you usually find their traditionalism is an entirely modern construct based usually in some idea of the 1950s or the Council of Trent or whatever it is. But it's only, as it were, in the modern age are we capable of that kind of fundamentalism. Because, and on the other side, what keeps surprising some of my more kind of liberal and progressive Catholic friends is just how rooted in tradition Francis is. I mean, he really is rooted in tradition, which is why he won't move ahead on anything unless he feels, well, the Holy Spirit's there. So you remember in Querida Amazonia, he simply ignored the question of the Viri Probati, which had been so much the center of attention in October last year at the Amazonian Synod. And he explained in a note which was published by Civiltà Cattolica, but in fact, we go into it in much more detail in this book. It's really fascinating stuff. His own discernment of how the Holy Spirit speaks through a synod or not. And if he feels that there is a polarization there that has not been transcended, that the Holy Spirit has not, he simply won't move ahead. And in that sense, he believes passionately in the tradition and in the unity of the church. And so, of course, if you stand back from this and you say, well, the Pope is guiding the church by discerning the Holy Spirit, you realize this is not some radical modern creed. This is exactly how Jesus set the church up, and how the Pope should have been doing that and have been doing that for the last 2 centuries.
And we saw that come out so strongly in his letter to the church in Germany. I think some have mischaracterized that letter. Some have seen it as a kind of red light when it comes to the synodal way, and then the people who are involved in it have seen it as a green light. But I've always thought of it as like a yellow light, like a kind of caution. You're heading in a dangerous direction here. You need to engage in real discernment and not a kind of procedural progressivism. And that's something that is, again, in the Amazonian Synod, this idea that the distinction between true discernment and, I guess, ideological campaigning. And I see that more and more with Pope Francis, this distinction becoming apparent. And that's, for me, that's become a real guide to understanding his thought and a good guide to where he may draw the line when it comes to reform, even though I do agree that he is a great reformer, as you described him in the biography. Maybe this idea of Pope Francis's relation to tradition is a good way to segue into the most recent controversy regarding the civil unions and his comment on civil unions. Mike, do you happen to have the actual quote?
Oh boy, I can pull it up. You didn't prompt me on that one. Let me.
All right.
Hang on. Okay. So the first statement that he made that is used in the documentary is, homosexuals have a right to be a part of the family. They're children of God and have a right to a family. Nobody should be thrown out or be made miserable because of it. And the second statement following it was, what we have to create is a civil union law. That way they are legally covered. I stood up for that.
Now, when I first read that, immediately what came to mind was actually what you had written in The Great Reformer about what Pope Francis had done when he was Archbishop of
Buenos Aires.
Buenos Aires, yes. And he had proposed the idea of civil unions as a sort of substitute or substitute solution or support for civil unions, because civil unions already existed, I believe, in Argentina at the time. Support for civil unions as a sort of substitute for gay marriage proper. And so I saw that in context. It seems, because I knew about this 2010 episode, but it's had, and I didn't think it would be as controversial as it's become, but it struck a chord. Why do you think, because I don't think this was really intended by Pope Francis as a really out there sort of statement, why do you think it's had such a resonance in the media in recent days? And why do you think there's such controversy about it?
In part, this is the mystery of news and the news cycle. You're never quite sure what's going to just suddenly light everybody's fire and what won't. I have to say, I didn't know that he had made the comments. I hadn't seen the film. I had literally no idea about this story. And on last Wednesday afternoon, my phone, I was actually out walking with dogs, and my phone never stopped ringing for hours. And people phoning saying, what does he mean? What does he mean? And I got invited here in the UK on every show. I can tell you, Today program, which is our big morning, for the next morning. People were booking me like mad. But then, interestingly, the night before, most of them cancelled. And the reason is that they had realized by the evening that the Pope was not endorsing gay marriage. Because I think, honestly, that's how it was first put out. And Pope blesses gay unions was the newsroom story. And then, of course, they started to pick it apart. And I tried to do my bit by posting those pages from the Great Reformer on Twitter, which I think helped. And the story, of course, back in 2010, which is the one you've alluded to, there wasn't a civil unions law in Argentina as such. There had been one. There was a citywide one from 2010.
Okay, yeah.
Which was a kind of what we call in Britain a civil partnership law, which allowed cohabiting couples to have certain marital rights, or rights similar to those enjoyed by married couples. But 2010, what happened is suddenly out of the blue, the Kirchner government, in fact, it was Christina in power at the time, but Nestor, her husband, remained the power behind the throne, just really out of the blue came up with the same-sex marriage law, complete redefinition of marriage, and landed it suddenly on everybody's plate. And Kitchener was very, bold about it. I didn't put this in the book, but he said, I didn't give a crap about gay people. I just want to see Bergoglio. I want to kick Bergoglio in the balls. I mean, he used to speak like that. He was very obvious about it. It was a clear, easy win for him. Get the church to defend traditional marriage and you make them look homophobic. So the church was suddenly faced with this. And what Bergoglio did, and as I explained in a Commonweal article I've just done, is that he said to the bishops, look, there is nothing wrong with us advocating. We should advocate a law which recognizes, for example, the rights of cohabiting people to visit each other in hospital, make decisions about welfare and care, inherit property, that kind of thing. Those are rights which, as matters of civil justice, we should be advocating, not just for gay people, but for, spinster sisters, or because actually, as the law should encourage stable long-term partnerships. What happened is well known, is that Bergoglio, who was at the time president of the Bishops' Conference, lost that vote with the other bishops, mostly because the conservative wing of the bishops pointed to the 2003 document, which was a few years earlier, by the man who was now Pope, Joseph Ratzinger, saying under no circumstances should we recognize same-sex unions. So, they said, it was a classic Catholic argument, by endorsing civil unions, are we cooperating with, collaborating with, as they would call it, evil or disordered relationships? Anyway, in all of that, he got defeated. And what Bergoglio predicted exactly came to pass. We had in Argentina a polarization in which the church became the matter. It was no longer about gay rights. It was about the church imposing its law and all the rest of it. And as happened in this country, as has happened, David, very early on in your country, we have the marriage redefinition. And it makes me, and one of the reasons for writing this article in Commonweal is that this is personal for me, because back in 2012, when UK introduced its same-sex marriage law under David Cameron, I was still very involved in a project called Catholic Voices, which was all about getting the Catholic voice out in the media. And we were actually the only group of people, only group of Christians really, apart from a few evangelicals, who dared to go out and argue against gay marriage. So it's why I laugh when people accuse me of being a liberal. But I argued against gay marriage. But of course, what was thrown back in my face constantly was that the church wasn't even in favor in 2004 of civil partnerships for gay people. And of course, that was true, because exactly the same thing happened here. The UK bishops felt they couldn't, even though they wanted to, I think, back the Civil Partnerships Bill precisely because of that 2003 document. Anyway, all of this is by way of background to say that Bergoglio has consistently defended that idea, asked about it in a Mexican interview last year. He simply said it. He said the quote that you've read out. And again, this is Francis just telling the truth as it is. Has he written a document to strike down the CDF document of 2003? No, he hasn't. Has he made a solemn declaration? No, he hasn't. But he's told the truth. And the truth is people, you can recognize the civil rights of cohabitees without redefining marriage. And that doesn't imply approval of homosexual relationships, but it does recognize that those relationships have things which, are good and have a social good, just as anybody who sacrifices themselves in care for others, there's an element of good there that needs to be recognized. That's Francis. He just told the truth, and then we left us all to get on with it. And of course, we've had a week, haven't we, of endless speculation about where it all came from, the Vatican being quiet. I think Francis, he tells the truth and lets us work it out.
Well, even though I definitely believe firmly, clearly he said it, clearly he meant it. There does seem to have been a little bit of video editing to make it sound like the first statement was speaking to the second statement. But the thing that I find really interesting is this is from a 2019 interview with a Mexican journalist. And the full-length interview cut the statement about civil unions. Now, Jerry O'Connell from America wrote a fairly comprehensive insider view, and he said that this type of cut would have been approved by Pope Francis. So what I find fairly interesting, and I don't know the degree to which they knew the content of the documentary before it came out, it may have struck them completely by surprise, was that back in 2019, Pope Francis was either convinced or consented to, or maybe he even asked that piece be removed from the full interview, yet it came out anyway. A lot has been made about the Vatican's silence about this. And I don't know if I was being presumptuous, but in my most recent response to the response, so to speak, and especially in light of Jerry's article, I think there's a strong possibility that even though Francis wasn't anticipating this, he may see the hand of divine providence in the fact that it came out anyway, and in an unexpected way. I was looking back at all of his references to the God of surprises, and I don't think he regrets saying it, but maybe he thought at the time that the church wasn't ready to hear it, or it would have been too controversial.
I didn't entirely agree with Jerry that because that was removed from the Al-Azraqi interview, that was on the orders of Francis. I don't know. I think it could well have been a decision taken by the Secretariat of State, or I just don't know. And equally, we don't know how it was that the director of Francesco, where this quote appears, how he had access. Well, we know he had access to that original interview because the Vatican gave it to him. We don't know whether he came running up from the basement or wherever they keep these things and saying, wow, there's this quote here that I want to use. And they said, great, go for it. Or whether it just, how it happened, I don't know. But in a way, it doesn't matter. I'm sure the truth will come out somehow. Eventually, we'll know part of it. But I agree with you essentially, Mike. It's what he thinks, And he said it before. And Josh McElwee immediately produced a piece which perhaps went too far the other way, saying, "This is not news, guys. This is not news." It was news, but I also agreed with him. He had said it before, and therefore, I think a lot of us actually who have followed these things were surprised by the vehemence of the response, given that this was his clear view. And can I say also, this isn't just Bergoglio in Argentina who comes up with this. These discussions have been going on among our bishops, US bishops, Canadian bishops, European bishops for years. I know that the French and the Italian bishops, they've all faced same-sex marriage, marriage redefinition bills and laws and so on, and have grappled with this and have resented the 2003 document, not because they disagree with its defense of marriage, but because it's too hostile to that third possibility, and that they felt that their hands were tied. So I think Francis, if this was well planned, or he said to the director, look, I want this in other words, a very deliberate thing, it could well be simply because he wants to give greater freedom in the future to bishops because that ship has sailed in all of our countries. We've all got written, but there are many countries, of course, where gay people don't have often any rights at all. And I think he wants to give freedom to bishops to say, you know what, marriage is sacrosanct. It must be defended. Marriage cannot be redefined. But that does not stop us also advocating justice and rights for people for non-marital relationships, as I call them. why not? If those elements of those relationships serve the common good, and if in justice they need those legal protections, then the church should be advocating them. And this is why I ended up in my Commonweal article saying I find it quite fascinating on both the conservatives and the kind of liberal Catholics are saying to Francis, we want to know what you think about homosexual acts. They want him to judge, are gay people sinful or are they innocent? Is every sexual act? And what Francis is trying to do is what Jesus was trying to do, which is to say, go out of your comfort zone. It's not enough just to defend marriage. What is it that God is asking us to do with these people? How can we help these people? How can we move them along towards the greater knowledge of the love and mercy of Christ? And what does that demand of us, even if it takes us out of our comfort zone? So that's what I think he's doing. It's consistent with him and it's consistent with what he's always done.
I think, too, it shows his understanding of the historical situation that we're facing. It's very difficult, I think, to turn back the clock on some of these things, and you need a new approach after. There's one position that the church can take when, let's say, civil unions or gay marriage is a live debate in the society. But then once that debate has happened and the situation has changed, it becomes an established fact within the society. If we were going to take the 2003 document seriously into the letter, we would basically be obliged to fight to take away even civil unions from people who have already been granted them, and we'd supposedly be doing it for their own good. So there's a real risk there, I think, of after the debate has already happened and things have been established, of doing much more serious damage to other people and to the church by pursuing that exact line of thinking. Now, many of us know and work with people who are in gay marriages or civil unions, and it's not a nice feeling to imagine that we're on some kind of mission to dismantle their marriages legally. So I think he's pointing to a new way of approaching this, which will probably be more about evangelization and maybe, like we were talking about with Fratelli Tutti, this idea of just establishing a basic level of human fraternity with people who think and live differently, and then trying to work from there, to walk with them, even while we maintain our values.
And this is, I think, a really significant shift, which is really what the Second Vatican Council was about, which is to say that the primary focus of the church should no longer be on what one might call the defense of neo-Christendom. In other words, that it's about saying there is a Christian society in which law and culture reflects Christian values, and it's the job of politicians and the church to defend that in law, because that's all about power, that's all about the state. And there was a time, there was Christendom, but that no longer is the case. We live in pluralistic societies which are secular, which are pluralist, and the church has to exist in that environment. If it is to be taken seriously, it has to preach the love of God and the gospel to everybody, independently of those kinds of power interests. And I think this is what Francis gets so well, Aparecida got so well. The world has changed. We are in a post-Christian society, and the only possible option for the church in this context is to be the church of the first 2 centuries of the Christian era, which is to say, not with the support of law and culture, but to go out and offer the experience of the encounter with Christ. You don't go in judging people, you go in them offering the encounter with Christ and then allowing people to change over time. And so whoever people are and wherever they are, they have to know that love of Christ. So a lot of the response to Francis's civil unions remarks has revealed some really ghastly stuff in mindsets that many people have, I think particularly in the States. The anger, the hostility, the hatred towards minorities, towards gay people, towards anybody who tries to reach out to them. And it's a bit like we were saying earlier, Francis just has this ability to bring it all out of us. But yeah.
Yeah, I want to speak directly to what you were alluding to. Yes, I think clearly the second part of that statement is a change from the party line of the 2003 CDF document. To me, however, it's that first part about the gay sons or daughters, relatives, family members having a right to a family. And he said this on the plane. Now, granted, this was overshadowed because the Vigano testimony had just come out, but on the in-flight press conference on the way back from Dublin, he said almost the exact same thing, which is why, having read your book about Argentina and remembering that press conference, my reflection, I didn't need to know about video editing or anything. I knew he was talking about A, I knew he was talking about B, and he had said it all before. However, that first part where he spoke about the shunning brought me back to a 2014 interview that Cardinal Burke gave, I believe, to LifeSite News, where he actually advocated or said that families were morally obligated not to invite their LGBT family members to holidays if there were children present.
That was in the synod, the October 2014 synod. He said that. That's right.
Yeah, and then yesterday, I believe Ed Penton, the British journalist, the Vatican correspondent for the National Catholic Register, posted an anonymous essay by an American priest, canon lawyer. It could have been Cardinal Burke for all I know with that description, but somebody who obviously looks to Cardinal Burke as a mentor, or I would suspect that, who advocated for the same thing, for cutting off contact when somebody is living a lifestyle that is contrary to Christian moral beliefs, specifically that kind of lifestyle. Certainly, there are plenty of people who oppress the poor or underpay their workers or cheat on their taxes who they wouldn't have a problem with inviting over to dinner. This is perhaps the clearest and most stark difference between Pope Francis and a lot of his quote unquote traditionalist or reactionary critics. Like, it's black and white. Pope Francis says, welcome them. They're still your family. You still love them. Treat them with kindness. Listen, share, make people who don't agree with you part of your life. Have an encounter with them, as opposed to this, it's a scandal. They shouldn't come. They shouldn't be there. The fact that they exist creates great damage. And I know in 2014, Cardinal Burke said something like, you do want to keep a relationship, if possible, for the purpose of getting them to leave the lifestyle. Like, a utilitarian interest would be the only motivation to maintain this relationship with a son, daughter, brother, sister. And I guess the fact that Cardinal Burke never retracted, never clarified, it was posted in 5 or 6 places. There is a huge gulf between Francis's approach and the approach of these so-called Orthodox Catholics. And I mean, I can understand why there's a conflict if the worldviews are this contrary to each other. And I wonder how we got to this point.
I mean, so what happens is that people descend into ideology, and they do so often because they become fixated on 1 or 2 propositions, or maybe there's stuff in their own lives that they're running away from and they haven't resolved. I have to say, in the case of homosexuality, you do wonder when you listen to who is being most condemnatory, whether there's not internal issues involved there. But anyway, whatever the reason is, you become fixated on 1 or 2 things, and that descends over time into an ideology. To come back to our book, which I can't talk too much about, but in part 2, Francis talks beautifully. Well, I encouraged him to, because I love his stuff on what's called the isolated conscience. And he shows really this descent, how people descend into ideology. And it can happen, frankly, to anybody in any of us. In other words, it can happen to religious people, non-religious people. And it's this, but in the case of Catholics, it's closing yourself off from the church, from the body of of God's people. You do so by setting yourself up, first of all, as somebody who is pure, as somebody who sees things that other people don't. It's the classic temptation of fundamentalism. And then to believe that this or that group of traditionalists or purists, or on the left it would be progressives or whatever, only we have the truth. And so this very elitist viewpoint, which you never find among the poor and among the ordinary faithful. It's always an elitist attitude. In some cases, descends into an ideology. And behind that, there is always the desire to hold on to something, which the Jesuits in the Jesuit Ignatian exercises is called riches, honor, and pride. In other words, there is a gain to be made from being religious in the case of some people. It gives them real power. And because they don't want to give it up, they hold on to it more and more tightly, and then you get the construction. And then you end up with, frankly, with the kinds of ranting insanity of an Archbishop Vigano, who's just, David brilliantly shows, completely gone off the rails. How does that happen? How do you take this Vatican diplomat who becomes And we're talking here not about an intellectual degeneration. We're talking about a spiritual corruption. And then the mind then is so anyway, I find all this amazing and very, very interesting. And that is part of who we have to deal with. Again, when you're a mature Christian, you have to deal with the fact that not everybody who calls themselves Christians necessarily has that relationship with Christ or that openness to the Holy Spirit. And we've got to deal with that. Our church has always been full of every kind of people and still is. And again, if you want a childish faith, some of these guys are cardinals. It's just a fact. But then look at the first apostles. Not all of them turned out well. That's part of the mystery of our church. And by the way, as I often say to people about it, our church is not a good institution. Only God is good, as Jesus said. What the church is a place of spiritual combat and a place of spiritual temptation. And it's in the dynamism of that. We're none of us that far away from corruption, any of us. Where there is good, there is the opposite and so on. We are a tempted people. And therefore, we're all on the snakes and ladders. And that's, I think, what's so glorious in many ways about the Catholic Church. If we were all perfect heroes and saints, it would be rather dull and there would be no real challenge.
This concludes part 1 of our interview with Austen Ivereigh. Once again, his upcoming book is Let Us Dream, The Path to a Better Future by Pope Francis, and it's due to be released on December 1st, just in time for Christmas. We are especially grateful to our Patreon sponsors, especially Melinda, Jeannie, Steve, William, Lisa, and Joshua. Thank you. We can't do it without you. If you enjoy our website and content and you would like to support us, please consider becoming a Patreon sponsor. Click on one of the links provided to visit our Patreon page. Finally, here's a preview of part 2 of our interview with Austen Ivereigh, where we talk with him about the new cardinals who were recently appointed by Pope Francis.
I don't think Francis ever appoints a cardinal whom he does not recognize as being a great pastor, a great evangelizer, a person of prayer, and so on. So these are clearly men who have struck him. He's got to know them. He's impressed by them. He thinks they should be part of the college.
You can look for part 2 to be released in the coming days. Patreon supporters will get a first listen. I'm Mike Lewis, and on behalf of all the contributors to wherepeteris.com, until next time, God bless and take care.